She couldn't sit down. Not yesterday, not the day before, not for 19 days straight. And every person in that town walked past her like she was furniture. But when Caleb Morgan rode in from the mountains and saw her trembling behind that telegraph desk, something in him went absolutely still. The kind of still that comes right before a storm. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and follow every single part to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1881 hit Red Hollow, Colorado, like a punishment from God. The kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin, it got inside your bones and made everything feel wrong. Made the dust stick. Made the horses mean. Made men who were already cruel feel justified in their cruelty because the sky itself seemed to be pressing down, telling everything below it to just endure. Sarah Whitaker had been enduring for 19 days. She stood behind the telegraph desk at 7 in the morning, the way she had stood behind it every morning since the night she could not think about without her hands beginning to shake. She was 25 years old, and she had always been proud of her steadiness, proud of her clear penmanship, her fast fingers on the telegraph key, her ability to hold a professional face, no matter what walked through that door. Postmistress. Telegraph operator. The only woman in Red Hollow who held an official position, and she had earned every inch of it. Now she stood because she could not sit, not without the kind of pain that stole the breath from her lungs and turned her vision white at the edges. Not without feeling what Victor Hargrove had done to her all over again, down to the exact grain of the floor she'd been thrown against. So she stood. She stood through the morning heat. She stood through the afternoon customers who brought their letters and their small talk. She stood through the long silences between customers when she had nothing to focus on but the burning under her spine and the knowledge that no one in this town was going to say a word about it, because they all knew. That was the thing about Red Hollow that Sarah had stopped being able to pretend about. They knew. Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the dress shop, knew because she had seen Sarah walking home that night and looked away. Deputy Frank Larson knew because he had been the one to tell Sarah very quietly, very firmly, that it would be better for everyone if she let the whole business settle without making noise. Dr. Horace Pell knew because he was the one who had written in his official record that Sarah Whitaker had suffered a fall. A fall. 19 days ago, Sarah Whitaker had fallen. That was the story Red Hollow had decided on, and every person in it had put their hand on that story like a Bible and sworn. Only one person had ever asked her if she was all right. Old Mabel Greer, who was half blind and mostly deaf, and had grabbed Sarah's wrist outside the post office 3 days after it happened, squinted up at her and said, "You look like something terrible got done to you, child." And Sarah had smiled and said, "I had a fall. Miss Mabel, I'm fine." Because even then she already understood the rules. She was standing at the desk at 9:30 when she heard the wagon. Red Hollow got wagons every day. Wagons with supplies from Denver, wagons with miners heading up to the claims wagons with the kind of drifters who looked at the town for an hour and kept moving because there was nothing here worth stopping for. Sarah didn't look up from the letter she was sorting. She had trained herself not to look up at sounds. Looking up meant showing her face, and her face had a habit lately of saying things she couldn't afford for anyone to see. The wagon stopped directly in front of the post office. She heard boots hit the ground. One man, heavy but not loud, the kind of step that knew exactly how much noise to make and had decided on less. She kept her eyes on the letters. R. Calloway, M. Dunbar, T. Fredericks. She pressed her thumbnail into the edge of each envelope just hard enough to feel the paper, which helped when the pain was rising. The door opened. She looked up because she had to, because she was the postmistress and that was her job. And her first thought was that she had never seen this man before, which meant he wasn't from Red Hollow and didn't know the rules. And something about that made her heart do a complicated thing in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. He was tall. Not the exaggerated tall of men who wanted you to notice, just genuinely factually tall, with the kind of build that came from a decade of mountain living. All of it functional, none of it decorative. Somewhere in his mid-30s. Sun-dark skin and dark eyes, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. He wore trail clothes canvas and leather a duster that had seen serious weather boots that were good quality but had earned their worn places. His hat was a straight-brimmed brown that he didn't tip when he came in, which most men in Red Hollow did automatically when they entered a building with a woman in it. He didn't tip it because he wasn't looking at her hat-tipping situation. He was looking at her, not the way men usually looked at her. Not assessing, not dismissive, not the particular kind of careful that the men in town had developed since the night of the incident. He was looking at her the way she imagined a man who had spent years reading terrain would look at something that didn't sit right, like he was cataloging, like something had already fired in the back of his mind that he was still in the process of confirming. "Help you," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "Need to pick up a package," he said. "Should be under Morgan, Caleb Morgan." She turned to the shelf behind her. Turning was one of the movements that cost her a specific twist at the base of her spine that sent a white line of pain shooting upward, and she absorbed it without making a sound, which she had also gotten very good at. The package was there, a wrapped parcel from a supplier in Denver, and she brought it back to the counter and set it down between them. "That'll be 40 cents, she said. He didn't reach for his coin. He was still looking at her, but differently now. She could feel it even without meeting his eyes. Could feel the quality of his attention shifting, narrowing the way a man's focus narrows when he stops looking at a situation and starts reading it. "You've been standing since I came in," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't exactly an accusation. It was the statement of a man who observed things precisely and said what he saw. "I stand at my desk," she said. "It's how I work. You haven't shifted your weight once." Her hands stilled on the package. "Mr. Morgan?" she said carefully. 40 cents. He put the coins on the counter. He didn't pick up the package. "You're holding yourself like something's wrong at your lower back," he said, still in that same quiet level voice. No drama in it, just information. "Left side worse than right. You keep your breathing shallow. Every time a sound comes from outside, your shoulders go up before you can stop them." The blood had drained from her face. She could feel it going, feel the cold that came in behind it, feel the sudden terrible awareness that this stranger, this man she had never met, who had been in this building for less than 3 minutes, had just seen more of her than anyone in Red Hollow had chosen to see in 19 days. "Please," she said very quietly. The word came out before she could choose it. "Please don't ask." Something moved in his eyes. Not pity. She would have been able to handle pity, would have known how to wall herself off from it. This was different. This was the look of a man who had just made a decision. "I'm not asking," he said. "I already know something happened to you. And I can see that this town knows it too. Mr. Morgan." "Caleb." "Mr. Morgan?" Her voice had gone to iron. Iron was what she had. "If you start asking questions in this town, there will be consequences. Not for you. You'll ride back up your mountain and be just fine." She held his gaze because she needed him to understand this, needed him to really hear it. "For me." A silence. Outside, she heard the familiar sound of boots on the boardwalk, and her shoulders went up exactly the way he had said they did, and she hated that he was there to see it confirmed. The door of the post office opened, and Deputy Frank Larson leaned in, one hand on the frame, casual as a man checking the weather. He was 38, thick through the chest, with a badge that had been polished that morning, and a smile that never reached his eyes. "Morning, Miss Whitaker," he said. And then his gaze moved to Caleb, and something shifted in it. Not fear, assessment. "Don't believe I've seen you before. Don't believe we've met," Caleb said. He had turned to face the deputy without hurrying. His voice was unchanged, same level, same quiet. "Frank Larson, Deputy Sheriff of Red Hollow." He let the title sit there for a moment. "You just passing through, picking up a package. Good." Larson smiled again, showing teeth this time. "We like folks who pick up what they need and keep moving. Peaceful town, Red Hollow. We work real hard to keep it that way." "I can see that," Caleb said. The deputy's gaze moved to Sarah. "Everything all right here, Miss Whitaker?" And there it was, the question that was not a question, the checking in that was not concern. It was a reminder. She was standing in her post office in front of a stranger she hadn't chosen, and Frank Larson was standing in her doorway, making sure she understood the geography of her situation. "Everything's fine, Deputy," she said. "Mr. Morgan was just collecting his package." Larson nodded slowly like a man satisfied. "You have a good day now." He let his eyes rest on Caleb for one more second. Just one, just long enough to make the intention clear. And then he was gone. His boots moved away down the boardwalk, unhurried. The post office felt different after he left. Smaller. Sarah realized her hands were flat on the counter, pressing down, which was something she did when she needed to stay upright and make it look voluntary. "He checks on you," Caleb said. It was not a question. "He's the deputy," she said. "That's his job." "Checking on you specifically." She didn't answer. Caleb picked up his package from the counter. He tucked it under his arm, and he looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that said he was memorizing something, filing it away in whatever system he used to organize what he saw and what it meant. "I'm going to get a room at the boarding house," he said. "I've got business in town for a few days." "There's nothing here worth staying for." "I'm beginning to think there might be." He walked to the door, put his hand on the frame, didn't turn around when he said, "I'll be back for my afternoon post, Miss Whitaker." And then he was gone. Sarah stood at her counter for a long time after the door closed. The pain was constant and familiar, and she breathed around it the way she had learned to. She thought about Caleb Morgan's eyes, the way they had moved over her, not with desire or mockery, but with the terrible accuracy of someone who looked at things honestly. She thought about what she had whispered to him. "Please don't ask." And the fact that he hadn't asked. He had simply told her what he saw. She didn't know if that was better or worse. Caleb Morgan had come to Red Hollow for supplies and to settle a minor land boundary question with a surveyor who operated out of the town's small office on the eastern side of Main Street. He had expected to spend one day, maybe two, and return to his cabin on the upper slope of the Sangre Range, where he had been living for the past 4 years, in the particular piece of a man who has decided that civilization suits him better from a distance. He had not expected the postmistress. He got a room at Haskell's boarding house, which was run by a thin woman named Mrs. Haskell, who charged him a fair rate and asked no questions, which he appreciated. He put his parcel in the room and washed his face and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what he had seen. In the army, they had trained him to read terrain. Every landform told you something. Every shadow in the rock was information. You learned to look at a hillside and understand its intentions, where it would channel water, where it would crumble, where a man could hide, and where he'd be exposed. That kind of seeing didn't leave a person when they left the service. It just transferred. You looked at people the same way. You read the landscape of them. Sarah Whitaker was a woman who had survived something. He'd seen the signs clearly enough that he hadn't needed a single piece of context to read them. The guarded posture, the shallow breathing, the way she held herself like a person who had learned that motion caused pain and had reorganized their entire body around minimizing it. The flinch at sound that she'd almost managed to suppress. That flinch was the kind that didn't come from a fall, didn't come from illness. That kind of flinch was a body that had learned at close range that the world was capable of sudden violence. And then there was the town, a town where a deputy walked in to check on a woman who hadn't asked for checking on. A town where everyone he'd passed on his way to the boarding house had the specific quality of people maintaining a pretense. He'd been in towns like that before, not often, but enough to recognize the texture of a place that had collectively decided not to see something. He ate supper at the boarding house table with 2 other boarders, a surveyor named Bates and a traveling dry goods salesman who talked too much, and he let them talk and watched the way Mrs. Haskell moved around her kitchen, which told him something, and the way Bates refused to meet his eyes when the conversation came anywhere near the post office, which told him more. He went to bed early and lay awake thinking. In the morning, he returned to the post office. She was standing where he'd left her, which he had expected. She was wearing a different dress, gray today, and her dark hair was pinned up more carefully than yesterday, and she had put on the face of a professional woman going about her professional mourning, and it fit her like a mask over a wound. "Mr. Morgan," she said. No warmth, no coldness, a voice maintained precisely at neutral. "Morning." He put his hat on the counter. "I need to send a telegram." She slid the form across without a word. He wrote his message, a legitimate message to his land agent in Denver about the boundary survey, and pushed it back to her. She read it, and he watched her read it, and then she looked up at him with something complicated moving behind her eyes. "This will go out within the hour," she said. "Appreciate it." He didn't leave. She looked at him. "Is there something else? How long have you been postmistress here?" A pause. She decided to answer. 3 years. "You like the work?" "I'm good at it." "Those aren't the same thing." Something shifted in her face, just briefly, like a door opened a crack and then was shut again. "I like it too," she said quietly. "I like that information moves through here. I like being the person who knows things." "What do you know?" he asked. It was a genuine question, and it landed like one. She stared at him. "About this town," he said. "About what runs it." "Mr. Morgan." Her voice had dropped low. The post office was empty, but she was watching the windows. "I am going to ask you once plainly, and I need you to hear me. Leave this town today. Take your package and your survey business and go back to wherever you came from. What's here is not your business, and it is not your fight." "No," he said. Just that. She blinked. She had expected argument, maybe, explanation. She had not expected the flattest, quietest no she had ever heard in her life delivered by a man who said it like it wasn't even worth discussing. "You don't understand what you're—" "I understand exactly what I'm looking at." He leaned forward slightly on the counter, and his voice didn't change, but it got specific, like a finger pointing at something. "There's a deputy who checks on you like a warden checks on a prisoner. There's a doctor in this town who's avoided looking in my direction since I arrived, which tells me he's got something to hide from a stranger who hasn't yet given him any reason for guilt. The woman who runs the boarding house goes quiet every time the mayor's name gets mentioned. And you are standing on your feet in pain, and you have been for long enough that you can't remember how to compensate for it correctly anymore." Sarah's jaw had tightened. Her hands were flat on the counter again. "You are going to get yourself killed," she said. "I've been told that before." "By people who were wrong," she said sharply. "You're not in those mountains anymore, Mr. Morgan. Mayor Hargrove owns this town. His son owns the people in it. The law here is whatever they decide it is on a given morning, and there is no one—" Her voice cracked, just the edge of it, and she pulled it back. "No one coming to change that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did his son do to you?" She went still. The question sat between them like something physical. Outside, a wagon rolled past. Someone called out a greeting to someone else. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning in a town that had made itself very good at ordinary. "I had a fall," she said. Her voice was no longer cracking. It was barely there at all. 19 days ago, I had a fall. That is the official record, and that is what happened. That's what the doctor wrote. That is what happened. He looked at her. She held his gaze, and she was good at it. She was very good at it. But he had spent 4 years in mountains, where the difference between reading something right and reading it wrong was the difference between making it home and not. And he knew what a person looked like when they were forcing themselves to say a thing they didn't believe. "All right," he said. He picked up his hat. She blinked, surprised that he was letting it go. "When my telegram gets a reply," he said, "I'll come back for it." He walked to the door. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She didn't say anything for a moment. He waited. "They're watching you already," she finally said. "The men who work for Hargrove. You've been in town less than a day, and they're already watching." "Good." he said. "Saves me the trouble of finding them." He left. Mayor Dalton Hargrove held court in the Red Hollow Town Hall every Tuesday and Thursday morning, which was a formal way of saying he sat in a large chair and people came to ask him for things, and he decided whether to give those things or not, based on a calculation he never explained to anyone. He was 61, silver-haired, impressive in the way of men who had been handsome once, and had spent the decades since then converting that handsomeness into authority. His son Victor had his father's jaw and none of his restraint. Victor Hargrove was 28 years old, and he had grown up in a town where his father's name opened every door, and this had produced in him a kind of casual immunity to consequences that expressed itself as a very particular brand of cruelty. Not the cruelty of a man who enjoyed violence for its own sake, but of a man who had never once had to account for what he did, and had quietly lost the capacity to understand that he should. On the Thursday morning of Caleb Morgan's second day in Red Hollow, Victor was sitting across from his father's desk, boots up, working a piece of rawhide through his fingers, when Deputy Larson knocked and came in. "There's a man," Larson said. Hargrove looked up from his papers. "There are many men, Frank." "Stranger. Came in yesterday. Mountain man from the look of him. Army build." Larson paused. He went to the post office twice. The room was quiet. Victor's hands had stopped moving on the rawhide. "He asked her questions," Larson continued. "I came in while they were talking. He wasn't the kind of man who asks questions like he's just curious." "What kind was he?" Hargrove said. Larson thought about how to answer that. "The kind," he finally said, "who already thinks he knows the answer." Victor dropped his boots to the floor. "Then we explain his mistake. Victor." His father's voice was mild. It was always mild. That mildness was the thing that made men in Red Hollow more afraid of Dalton Hargrove than they were of his son, because cruelty you couldn't predict had its own geography. But mildness that never changed was something else entirely. "Don't be hasty." He was in the post office. Lots of people use the post office. He was asking about her. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have someone keep a closer eye on him, that's all, just yet." Victor picked up his rawhide again. But he didn't start working it. He just held it and looked at the middle distance and said nothing. That night, Sarah sat on the floor of the back room of the post office because it was the only place she could be alone without someone being able to see through a window. She sat with her back against the wall very carefully and breathed through the pain until it settled into something manageable. She was not generally a woman who cried. She hadn't cried since the first night, but sometimes she sat on the floor of the back room and breathed, and that was allowed. That was private. That was hers. She thought about Caleb Morgan. She thought about the way he had said no, not like a man with a hero's intention, like a man who had assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was simply no, and no further discussion was required. She had told him they were watching him. He had said it saved him the trouble of finding them. Something about that, the simple reversal of it, the way it flipped the power of observation around, so that the watchers became the watched, had done something to her chest that she was still trying to identify. She pulled her knees up very slowly and wrapped her arms around them. The pain was there. It was always there. But tonight it felt slightly less like the whole world and slightly more like a thing she was carrying. Through the thin wall of the post office, she heard the sounds of Red Hollow settling into its night. The saloon 2 streets over. A horse somewhere. Wind coming down off the mountains cooler than the day, the way mountain air always moved down at night like a tide going out. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed. Tomorrow, she thought. She would figure out tomorrow when tomorrow came. But somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the fear and the pain and the 19 days of careful silence, something had shifted very slightly. Something small and stubborn had lifted its head. She thought, he said no, like it was simple. She thought, what if it could be simple? She had been alone in this for so long that the possibility, not the certainty, not even the probability, just the bare possibility of not being alone in it anymore, felt like water to a woman who had forgotten she was thirsty. She sat on the floor of the back room of her post office in Red Hollow, Colorado, in the long hot summer of 1881, and she let herself think about what it would mean if one person in this world chose to look at the truth of what had been done to her and not look away. And the mountain wind came through the crack under the door. And outside in the darkness, she would have sworn she heard a single pair of boots moving slowly along the boardwalk in front of her building and then stopping. And then, after a long moment, moving on. Caleb Morgan did not sleep much that night. He sat on the edge of the bed in Haskell's boarding house and worked through what he knew, the way he used to work through terrain before a patrol, methodically without emotion, building the map piece by piece until the shape of it became clear. The shape of Red Hollow was becoming clear, and it was not a good shape. He knew this. A young woman was standing on her feet in serious physical pain and had been doing so for 19 days, and the entire town around her had agreed without ever holding a vote or signing a paper to call it a fall and move on. That kind of agreement didn't happen by accident. That kind of agreement required something holding it in place. Fear, usually. Or money. Or both, which in his experience was almost always the answer, because fear and money had a way of finding each other. He knew this too. The deputy had walked into that post office within 20 minutes of his arrival, which meant someone had been watching the post office, which meant someone considered the post office worth watching, which meant Sarah Whitaker was not as invisible to the powers of this town as they wanted her to believe she was. In the morning, he ate breakfast at the boarding house table and listened. The surveyor Bates was talking about the new mining claims being filed up on the northern ridge. Good ground, Bates said. Rich ground, the kind of ground that made men's eyes go bright and their manners go thin. He said Mayor Hargrove had been buying up adjacent parcels for the past 18 months, quiet-like through a land company out of Denver, so the name Hargrove didn't appear on the filings. Caleb poured himself more coffee and said, "That legal?" Bates looked at him the way people looked at a man who had just asked if the sun was hot. "In Red Hollow," he said carefully, "legal is a flexible term." "Must be useful," Caleb said, "to own the flexibility." Bates said nothing more after that. Caleb went to the post office. Sarah looked up when he came in, and something moved across her face. Not relief exactly. Not the uncomplicated kind, but the complicated version, the kind that comes with awareness of risk attached. She had slept badly. He could read that too. The shadows under her eyes had their own specific quality. "Your reply came in this morning," she said, and slid a folded telegram across the counter before he could speak. He picked it up, read it. His land agent in Denver had confirmed that the boundary survey on his mountain parcel was already on file, which meant his stated reason for being in Red Hollow had just evaporated. He folded the telegram and put it in his pocket. "I'll be staying a few more days," he said. She had been watching him read. Now she said very quietly, "Your business is finished." "My business changed." "Caleb." His name in her mouth the first time she had used it with a warning wrapped around it like wire. "I need you to understand something. There is a man in this town named Victor Hargrove. His father runs everything that can be run and owns everything that can be owned. Victor—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "Victor does not receive consequences. That is not a figure of speech. I am telling you as a factual statement that Victor Hargrove has done things in this town, and nothing has happened to him. Not once. Not ever. What did he do to you?" The directness of it hit her like a stone. She hadn't expected him to just say it flat out in the morning light like a man naming a weather condition. Her hands went to the counter, flat, pressing. "I told you," she said. "I had a fall." "Sarah. Don't." "I'm not asking you to say it to the law," he said. "I'm not asking you to say it in public. I am asking you right now in this room to tell me what happened to you. Because I have been in this territory for 4 years, and I have learned to read what I see, and what I see when I look at you is a woman who has been carrying the weight of something terrible entirely alone, and I would like you to put some of that weight down." The post office was quiet. From outside came the sound of boots on boards. Horses passing the ordinary texture of a morning in a small town. All of it felt very far away. Sarah Whitaker looked at Caleb Morgan for a long time. She looked at him the way a person looks at a door they have been told is locked, testing it in their mind before they put their hand on the knob. Then she said, "He came in after closing. I was alone. I always stay late to do the final count." A pause. Each word measured. I said no. He didn't care about that. He never has cared about that with anyone. Another pause, shorter. When he left, I couldn't get up for a while. I lay on this floor. She looked down at the floor between them, like she was remembering the exact geometry of it. When I could get up, I walked to Dr. Pell. He looked at me. He wrote down that I had fallen. He gave me something for the pain, and told me to rest, and to remember that accidents happen to everyone. The silence after that was the kind that had weight. Caleb didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He stood across the counter from her and held what she'd said with the full seriousness it deserved, and she watched his face for the things she'd feared. Pity, discomfort, the particular male desire to immediately fix something before they'd fully understood it, and she didn't find them. What she found instead was something close to fury. Very quiet, very still. The kind of fury that doesn't perform itself. "The land deed you mentioned," he said. "Your land deed." She blinked. She had not expected that pivot. "He threatened it," she said slowly. "After. He came back 2 days later. He told me that my deed to the post office property had an irregularity, that if I made noise, his father's office would find that irregularity, that I would lose the post office and the deed to the house behind it. He threatened your property to ensure your silence." "Yes. And you believed him." "I know this town," she said, and there was something ancient in her voice when she said it, something that had nothing to do with her 25 years. "I know what his father can do. I have watched it happen to other people." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I see your deed?" She stared at him. "What?" "Your land deed. Your official document of property ownership. Can I see it?" "Why?" "Because I want to know if there's actually an irregularity, or if that was a threat designed to keep you afraid without any substance behind it." She opened her mouth, closed it. He could see her thinking, see her running through the risk of it, and he waited while she did. She went to the back room. He heard a drawer open. She came back with a folded document and laid it on the counter between them. He read it carefully. He had enough familiarity with land documents from his own property dealings to understand what he was looking at. He read the entire thing twice. "There's no irregularity," he said. She had been watching his face. "You're sure?" "The filing is clean. The title is clear. The signature of the territorial recorder is legitimate. Victor Hargrove threatened you with a lie." Something happened to her face that she couldn't control. It was only there for a second, just a flash, raw and undefended, and then her professional mask came back up, and she pressed the deed back into her hands. "It doesn't matter," she said. "Even if the deed is clean, Hargrove has enough influence with the territorial office to make it dirty. He's done it before." "Maybe," Caleb said. "But a man who lies about the weapon he's holding is a man who isn't as certain of his power as he wants you to think." Before she could answer, the bell above the door rang, and 3 men walked in. Caleb knew them on sight for what they were. The way you know the shape of a rock formation you've seen before in different places. 2 of them were broad, 1 was lean. All 3 had the particular posture of men who were being paid to be somewhere, and had arrived at that location intending to make their presence felt. They weren't carrying their guns forward. That was the message, not yet. The lean one smiled at Sarah. "Miss Whitaker, Victor wanted us to check in, make sure everything's running smoothly." "Everything's fine," Sarah said. Her voice had gone to iron again so fast it could have cut glass. The lean one's gaze moved to Caleb. Took its time. "This the stranger we've been hearing about?" "Man picks up his mail." Caleb said, "You hear about it. Must be a slow town." The lean one's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "Victor was hoping you'd stop by the saloon tonight, have a drink, get acquainted." That an invitation or an instruction? A beat of silence. Friendly suggestion, the lean one said. I'll keep it in mind, Caleb said. The three men looked at each other just briefly, just enough, and then the lean one tipped his hat to Sarah in a way that had no courtesy in it and walked out, the other two behind him. The door closed. The post office felt like it had been holding its breath. Sarah said very quietly, "That's Denny Marsh. He runs Victor's hired men. He's been in 2 shootings that anyone knows about." Anyone survived them? One. Caleb picked up his hat from the counter. "I won't be going to the saloon tonight," he said, "but I'd appreciate it if you locked your doors early." Caleb. She said his name differently this time. Not a warning. Something more complicated. "What are you doing?" He looked at her. "Figuring out what this town is built on. And when you figure it out, then I'll know what to do next." He walked to the door. "The apothecary," she said quickly before he reached it. "Mr. Hines. He saw me the night it happened. I went to him first before the doctor. He was the one who told me to go to Pell. She stopped. He wasn't cruel about it. He was afraid, but he was there." Caleb turned back to look at her. "He might talk," she said. "If someone asked him the right way." "What's the right way?" "He's a decent man in a town that has punished decency," she said. "The right way is to remind him what decency costs and let him decide if he can still afford it." Caleb nodded once. Something in his expression had shifted just slightly, just enough for her to notice, and it was the closest thing to approval she had ever seen on a face that seemed to have very little use for performance. He walked out. She stood at her counter and realized her hands were trembling. Not from pain this time, from something else. From the strange, terrifying lightness of having said true things out loud to a person who listened to them. She pressed her hands flat on the wood of the counter until they stopped. Silas Hines had run the Red Hollow Apothecary for 11 years, and had spent most of them being careful. Careful was how you survived in a town shaped like Red Hollow. You measured your doses, and you kept your records, and you smiled at the right people, and you didn't look too closely at the things that happened at the edges of your vision. He was measuring out a tincture when Caleb Morgan walked through his door, and he knew immediately the way careful men always know that this was not a routine customer. "Mr. Hines," Caleb said, "can I help you?" It came out flat, not a question. "I'm looking for something for a rope burn," Caleb said. "Bad one, the kind that leaves a mark." All the sound seemed to go out of the room. Silas set down his measuring glass very carefully. His hands were steady because he had trained them to be, but the rest of him was not. He looked at the man across the counter from him and understood in the precise way of a man who had been waiting for something like this and hoping it wouldn't come exactly what was happening. "Rope burns," he said slowly. "There are several preparations." "I imagine there are. I imagine you've seen a few." The air between them was very specific. "I don't know what you think. I think," Caleb said with the same calm he'd used in the post office, the same absolute level quiet that somehow landed harder than shouting would have, "that you are a man who saw something 19 days ago that you have not been able to stop thinking about. I think you know exactly what happened to Sarah Whitaker because she came to you before she went to the doctor. I think you sent her to Pell because you were scared, and I think every day since then you have gotten up in the morning and looked at yourself in a mirror and had a conversation with yourself about that decision." Silas said nothing. His hands were on the counter now. "I'm not here to blame you," Caleb said. "I understand what it costs to speak in a town like this. I'm here to ask you a single question, and I want you to give me a single honest answer." "And if I don't," Silas said quietly, "what happens?" "Then you keep having that conversation with yourself in the mirror," Caleb said. "Every morning, for the rest of your life." The apothecary was very still. Silas Hines looked at the counter. He looked at his hands. He thought about the night Sarah Whitaker had come through his door with her hair loose and her dress torn at the shoulder, and her body held in that particular way that told any person with eyes what had been done to her. He thought about the look on her face when he told her to see the doctor. He thought about the look she'd had when she understood what he meant. Not just go see Pell, but go see Pell and understand the limitations of what Pell is going to be able to do for you in this town. "What's your question?" he said. "Did she have rope marks on her wrists when she came to you?" A silence that lasted a very long time. "Yes," Silas Hines said. Caleb nodded. He didn't look satisfied. He looked like a man who had confirmed something he wished he hadn't needed to confirm. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. He turned to leave. "She came here because she trusted me," Silas said behind him. His voice had changed. Something had cracked open in it. Something that had apparently been building pressure for 19 days. "She came here first because she thought I have known that girl since she was 17 years old, and she came to this town and took that post office job and built something real out of nothing. She came here first because He stopped. Caleb turned back to look at him. Silas's jaw was tight. His eyes were bright with something that was not going to become tears, because he was a man who had not cried in a very long time. "I sent her to Pell," he said. "Knowing what Pell would do, knowing what Pell was." He pressed his hands flat on the counter. "Tell me what I can do. Right now." Caleb said, "Nothing. Keep this conversation to yourself. Don't mention it to anyone, not even anyone you trust, because in this town, trust has been monetized." He held the apothecary's gaze. "When the time comes, I'll need a man who can say what he saw. That's what I'll need from you." "And when's the time coming?" Silas asked. "Soon," Caleb said. "Sooner than Hargrove thinks." He walked out of the apothecary into the afternoon heat, and he stood on the boardwalk for a moment and thought about what he had just built and what it would cost and whether he was ready to pay it. He had one witness, one man with direct knowledge of what had been done to Sarah Whitaker, the physical evidence he had personally observed, and a conscience that had been eating him alive for 19 days and was ready to talk. He needed more. He needed the thread that connected Victor Hargrove's violence to his father's cover-up, the official machinery that had been used to bury what happened. The doctor, the deputy, the land records. He needed to understand which parts of the structure were held up by genuine corruption and which parts were held up by fear that could be moved, because fear, in his experience, was a more flexible material than malice. He was thinking about this when he turned the corner and found Victor Hargrove standing in front of him. Victor was 28 and knew he was handsome in the way men know things that have always been confirmed for them, and he wore that knowledge in the carriage of his shoulders, the tilt of his chin, the absolute assumption of space that came with a life in which no one had ever successfully told him no. He had two men with him. Not Denny Marsh's crew, different men dressed better, which meant they were closer to the family. "You're the mountain man," Victor said, like it was mildly interesting. Like Caleb was a moderately unusual rock formation. "And you're the mayor's son," Caleb said, same tone. Same mildly interested quality. Victor smiled. He had a good smile. The kind that had probably worked very well for him in a great many situations. "I heard you've been asking around town about things that aren't really your business." "Hard to know what's your business until you ask," Caleb said. "Let me make it simple for you." Victor stepped slightly closer. Not close enough to be physical, not yet, but close enough to be a statement. "You're a man passing through. This is a good town, a peaceful town, and the people in it are happy and taken care of. Whatever story you've been told by whoever told it to you," a very small pause there, deliberate, "is the story of a woman with a tendency toward dramatics and a grudge." "Is that what the rope marks on her wrists were?" Caleb said. "Dramatics." Victor went very still. It was the stillness of a man who had just had the ground change under his feet without warning. And for just a moment, just one fraction of one moment, Caleb saw something behind Victor Hargrove's good smile that had nothing to do with confidence. It was there, and it was gone, and Victor's face rearranged itself into something harder and less pleasant. "I'd be very careful," Victor said quietly, "about the things I said out loud in this town, if I were you." "I appreciate the advice," Caleb said. "I'll keep it in mind." He stepped around Victor and walked on. He counted his steps as he walked. 1, 2, 3, 4. His back was to Victor and Victor's 2 men, and every trained instinct he had was mapping the situation behind him. Distance posture weapons he'd noted when they were face to face, the specific quality of Victor Hargrove's stillness when Caleb had said rope marks. He counted to 12, and nothing happened, and he turned the corner and exhaled once controlled. Victor knew that someone had talked. That was both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that Victor would now be moving faster, which made the timeline tighter. The opportunity was that a man moving fast made mistakes, that a man moving carefully did not. He went back to the boarding house and sat on the bed and put his thinking together in an orderly row. He had one witness with direct physical evidence. He had a land deed that was clean and a threat that was empty. He had a town full of people who were afraid, which meant they could be moved if the thing they feared became less powerful than what they were being asked to sustain. He needed one more crack in the structure. One more person willing to step out of the agreement Red Hollow had made with itself. He thought about the saloon owner. He thought about what Sarah had said, that Silas Hines was a decent man in a town that had punished decency. He thought about whether decency worked like water, the way it found every crack and eventually moved through. Then there was a knock on his door. He opened it. Mrs. Haskell stood in the hallway, and she had the look of a woman who had spent a significant portion of her morning arguing with herself about whether to do something and had recently lost the argument. She was holding a folded piece of paper. "I found this," she said, "in the room you're staying in, when I cleaned it this afternoon." She looked at him with fierce, frightened eyes. "It wasn't there when you arrived. Someone put it there this morning while you were out." He took the paper from her and opened it. Written in a careful, anonymous hand. "The doctor didn't write the report alone. Ask who else signed it." He looked at Mrs. Haskell. "You read it," he said. "I clean the rooms," she said. "I read things I find." "Do you know what it means?" Her jaw worked for a moment. "Dr. Pell," she said carefully, "has been the town doctor for 15 years. He signs his own reports, always has." A pause. "If he didn't sign this one alone, then someone else in an official position put their name to it." Another pause. "The deputy coroner for this county is a man named Thomas Wick. He rides circuit out of Pueblo. He was in Red Hollow 20 days ago." Caleb was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Mrs. Haskell looked at the wall past his shoulder. Her voice, when she answered, was barely above a breath. "Because I have had 3 women stay in this boarding house in the past 2 years, who left quietly in the night and never wrote to say where they went. And I have told myself that women have reasons for moving on that have nothing to do with this town." She swallowed. "I am tired of telling myself that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Haskell." She nodded once, sharp and final, and walked back down the hall. Caleb closed the door and sat down and looked at the note in his hand. Someone in Red Hollow had just chosen a side. That meant the structure was cracking on its own. That meant the weight of what this town had agreed to carry was getting to be more than some of its people could hold. He thought about Sarah on the floor of the back room of her post office. He didn't know that was where she'd been the night before. He didn't have that information. But he had stood on the boardwalk in front of her building in the dark and listened to the silence of it, and something in him had known she was still there, still inside, still carrying it. He thought about what she had said. He asked anyway, and the town never recovered. He thought about the note. Ask who else signed it. He thought about Thomas Wick, the circuit coroner, and what a man like that would do when he understood that his signature on a falsified report had been discovered by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. He stood up. He was going to need paper. He was going to need the telegraph. He was going to need Sarah Whitaker to send the most important message that had ever moved through the wires of her post office. He picked up his hat and went to find her. She was still at the desk. Of course she was, because she was always at the desk, because that desk was the one thing in Red Hollow that was entirely and unambiguously hers. And she looked up when he came in, and she read his face in one quick pass and said immediately, "What happened?" "I need you to send a telegram," he said. "Tonight, after the deputy's last rounds." "To who?" "The Federal Marshal's office in Denver." Something moved across her face. Complex and quick, like weather on open ground. Hope and terror traveling together the way they always did in situations like this one. "If they intercept it," she began. "They won't. I know how to word it." He put his hands on the counter and looked at her steadily. "Sarah, I have a witness. I have evidence of a falsified official record. I have a name, the circuit coroner who co-signed Pell's report. And I have your land deed, which is clean, which means the threat they used to silence you was a bluff." She was very still. "I have enough to bring this down," he said. "But I need a wire to Denver before Hargrove has time to move." He held her gaze. "And I need you to decide right now if you are willing to do this. Not for me. Not because I'm asking. For yourself. Because this is your life, and your post office, and your deed, and your body, and the decision has to be yours." The post office was quiet. Outside, Red Hollow went about its evening. Sarah Whitaker stood at her telegraph desk in the long copper light of a summer evening and looked at Caleb Morgan and thought about 19 days of standing. 19 days of pain. 19 days of smiling at the right people and saying the right nothing and carrying the weight of a lie that was not hers. She thought about Victor Hargrove's face and the way he had said dramatics and meant silence. She thought about the rope marks on her wrists that Silas Hines had seen and reported to no one for 19 days, and that a stranger from a mountain had nonetheless found out about in 2 days because he had simply looked at what was in front of him and refused to look away. She put her hand on the telegraph key. "Tell me what to write," she said. The telegram went out at 9:47 in the evening. Sarah's fingers on the key were steady. Caleb stood behind her and watched her work, and thought that whatever else this town had done to her, it had not taken her competence. She was fast, and she was accurate, and she encoded the message exactly as he dictated it. Careful language, no names that would immediately flag the wire if someone was monitoring the line, but with enough specific detail embedded in the phrasing that a federal marshal's office would understand exactly what they were being told. When she lifted her hand from the key, the silence felt different. Fuller. Like something had been released into the air that couldn't be called back. "How long for a reply?" Caleb said. "If someone's on the night wire in Denver a few hours, if not morning." She turned on her stool to look at him. "What if they don't come?" "They'll come." "You don't know that. I know that a falsified official record with a circuit coroner's signature is the kind of thing that gets federal attention," he said. "Because it's not just what was done to you, it's what was done to the office, to the record itself. That's a different category of crime, and the men in Denver know it." She thought about that. "You're using the paperwork." "I'm using every tool available." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Victor won't wait if he finds out that wire went out tonight. He won't find out tonight." Caleb moved to the window and looked out at the dark street. "But tomorrow is a different question." "Then what do we do tomorrow?" He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "Tomorrow, you open the post office at the normal time, and you do your normal work, and you do not change a single thing about how you carry yourself. Can you do that?" "I've been doing that for 19 days. "I know," he said. "I know you have." Something in his voice was different when he said that, quieter, with a weight to it that wasn't instruction or strategy, but something more like recognition. "One more day." She looked at him for a moment. "And what will you be doing?" "I'm going to visit the saloon." She stiffened. "Denny Marsh." "Denny Marsh will be there," he said. "That's why I'm going." She stood from her stool slowly with the particular careful movement she used for everything, and she faced him in the small space of the post office, and he could see her working through the argument she wanted to make and understanding before she made it that he had already made it himself. "You don't have to do this alone," she said finally. "I'm not," he said. "You just sent that wire." She held his gaze. He picked up his hat from the counter. He moved toward the door. "Lock up after me," he said. "Both locks." She followed him to the door, and he heard the bolt slide home behind him before he had taken 3 steps, and he thought that she was underneath everything this town had done to its level best to take from her, an extraordinarily capable woman. He walked toward the light and noise of the saloon and thought about what he was about to do and whether the risk calculation made sense. He decided it did. Not because it was safe, it wasn't safe, but because Denny Marsh was a man who moved by reading weakness, and the only language that registered in men like that was the language of a person who was not afraid of them. Caleb had learned that in the army and confirmed it every year since. There was a specific conversation you could have with a man like Marsh, and it only worked if you walked into it like you owned the ground under your feet. He pushed through the saloon doors. The Red Hollow Saloon was run by a man named Carl Grady, who had the look of someone who had witnessed a great deal and made peace with most of it. He was behind the bar when Caleb came in, and his eyes tracked Caleb with the particular attention of a man cataloging threats in real time. Denny Marsh was at a corner table with 2 of his men cards in front of them, whiskey at their elbows, the game mostly a pretext. They looked up when Caleb walked in. Marsh's face did the thing Caleb had been expecting, a very brief recalibration, because Caleb had been invited and had said he wouldn't come, and was now here, which meant the script Marsh had prepared was no longer the right one. Caleb pulled out the chair across from Marsh and sat down without being invited. "Thought you weren't coming," Marsh said. "Changed my mind." Caleb looked at the card game. "What are you playing?" "7 card. I'll play a hand." A pause. Marsh glanced at his men. Then he shrugged the practiced shrug of a man performing ease and dealt. They played. Caleb lost the first hand deliberately, not by much, just enough to be credible. He watched Marsh while they played, watched the way he held his cards, the way he watched the other players, the way his eyes moved to the door every 4 or 5 minutes. He was waiting for something, or checking on something. "You work for Victor Hargrove," Caleb said during the second hand, conversational, like stating the weather. "I work for myself," Marsh said. "But Victor pays you." "Lots of men pay me." "For what?" Marsh smiled, the same smile that meant nothing. "Problem solving. That what you call it?" "What would you call it?" Caleb laid down his cards. "Depends on the problem and the solution." He looked at Marsh evenly. "Victor has a problem right now. A mountain man who's been asking questions. You were sent to my room this afternoon." Marsh went very still. "You put a note under my door," Caleb said. And then Marsh did something Caleb had not predicted. He laughed. It was short and genuine and surprised, and it changed the geometry of the moment entirely. "That wasn't me," Marsh said. Caleb looked at him. "I know what note you're talking about," Marsh said, and his voice had dropped, and the performance had come off it, and what was underneath was something considerably more complicated than the man Caleb had walked in expecting to find. "And it wasn't me. I have been following you since you hit town, yes. Victor's orders. But I didn't put that note in your room." "Then who did?" Marsh picked up his whiskey. He looked at it for a long moment. "Victor's problem," he said carefully, "is that not everyone who works for him the same way. Some men work for a paycheck. Some men work because they don't have a better option. And some men," he took a drink, "have been watching things happen in this town for long enough that their stomach's full of it." The saloon noise moved around them indifferent. "You're telling me someone in Hargrove's circle sent me that note," Caleb said. "I'm not telling you anything," Marsh said. "I'm playing cards with a stranger." He set his glass down. "But I'll tell you this because it might keep you alive long enough for whatever you're planning to work. Victor knows the wire went out tonight." Caleb's face didn't change. Not a single thing on it changed. "He was watching the line," Marsh said. "Not the message, he doesn't have the key. But he knows a message went out after hours from the post office, and he knows the postmistress has been left alone with a stranger for 2 days, and he's not stupid whatever else he is." He picked up his cards again. "He'll move tomorrow." "What does that mean, move?" "It means he'll do what he does when he wants something handled quietly," Marsh said. "He'll find a reason to put pressure on the girl. On her property. Something official looking. Something that ties her up in the legal machinery long enough for whatever you sent to Denver to get lost in its own bureaucracy. He can't touch the deed, Caleb said. Marsh looked at him sharply. You checked it. It's clean. For the first time, something that might have been genuine surprise moved across Marsh's face. He told her it wasn't. He lied. Marsh put his cards face down on the table. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, like a man doing arithmetic in his head. Then he said very quietly, "Son of a bitch." He used a threat with no substance to keep her silent. If that deed's clean... Marsh trailed off, came back. Then everything Hargrove's been using to hold this town together has the same problem. Does it? Caleb said. It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. It was an invitation, and Marsh sat with it for a long moment, and Caleb waited, because he had learned that the most important conversations required patience at their center, and he was a patient man. There are 3 other families in this town, Marsh said finally, who were told their properties had irregularities. 3 families who have been paying Hargrove a percentage of their business income in exchange for him not pursuing those irregularities in the territorial court. A pause. If the Whitaker deed is clean, then the others likely are too, Caleb said. Marsh looked at him for a long time. What do you need? He said, just like that. Plain and flat, like a door swung open. The coroner who co-signed the medical report, Caleb said. Thomas Wick. Where is he right now? Pueblo, 3-hour ride. Can someone reach him tonight? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know a man who rides fast. Tell him to ride. Caleb stood up from the table. He put his hat on. And Marsh, the note in my room. Whoever sent it, tell them they made the right call. He walked out of the saloon into the dark. He didn't go back to the boarding house. He went to the post office. He knocked 3 times in the pattern he'd told Sarah to listen for before he left. And after a moment, he heard her footsteps and the bolt sliding back, and then the door opened, and she was there, still dressed, clearly not having slept. Victor knows, he said. She absorbed that without flinching, which told him she had already considered the possibility. How bad? He'll move tomorrow, officially. He'll try to use the legal machinery to tie you up. The deed? I told Marsh, the deed is clean. She blinked. You told Marsh? Marsh didn't put the note in my room. Someone else in Victor's circle did. Marsh is... He paused, choosing his word, reconsidering his position. She stared at him. You walked into that saloon and flipped Denny Marsh. I walked into that saloon and had a conversation with a man who's been swallowing something ugly for long enough that he was ready to spit it out. She put her hand over her mouth. Just for a second. Pressed her fingers against her lips and breathed through them, and then lowered her hand and looked at him with something in her eyes that he didn't try to name. Caleb, she said, if this goes wrong, I need you to do something difficult, he said. Tonight. Right now. She straightened. What? I need a list of every property in Red Hollow that you know or suspect Hargrove has claimed an irregularity against. Every name, every family. You run the post office. Information moves through you. You've seen letters, you've heard conversations, you've been here 3 years, and you're observant. He held her gaze. What do you know? She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved in the way of a person organizing, sorting, pulling threads from a much larger tangle. Then she moved to her desk and took out a sheet of paper and began to write. He watched her write and thought about the note in his room. Ask who else signed it. Someone inside Hargrove's machinery had wanted him to know about Thomas Wick. Someone had been watching Caleb Morgan for 2 days and decided he was trustworthy enough to point in the right direction. That person was still out there, still unknown, and the fact of them was both reassuring and concerning, because unknown allies in dangerous situations had a way of being complicated. Sarah pushed the paper across the desk. 6 names, 6 families. He looked at the list and then looked at her. You knew all of this. I knew pieces, she said. I didn't know they were connected. I didn't know they were all the same mechanism. Her voice had gone very quiet. I thought the things that happened in this town happened separately. I didn't understand it was a system. It's always a system, he said. She looked at the list. These are people who've been paying Hargrove for years. People who've been afraid to speak because they thought they were alone. She looked up at him. If they knew the deeds were clean, they might not stay quiet, Caleb said. She stood from the desk. For a moment, she just stood there, and he could see something shifting in her. Something that had been held at a particular angle for 19 days, slowly, carefully moving. We have to tell them, she said. Not tonight. Caleb. Tonight we secure the evidence. Tomorrow we move. He looked at her steadily. Can you reach these families through the post office without it looking like anything but routine business? She thought about it. 3 of them get regular post. I can get a word to each of them when they come in tomorrow morning without anyone watching understanding what I'm saying. Good. And the other 3? I'll handle those. She looked at him, and he could see the question she was deciding whether to ask, and then she asked it. Why are you doing this? She said. I know you gave me an answer before, but I mean truly. You came here for a boundary survey. You could have left 2 days ago with your package and your clean telegram reply and gone back to your mountain. Instead, she gestured at the paper, the plan, the whole shape of it. Why? He was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer that honestly without saying more than was useful. I grew up in a town like this, he said finally. Different state, different names, same structure. My mother spent 8 years believing a lie about a piece of land that my father had legally filed and legally owned because a man with money and a lawyer told her it wasn't clean and she didn't have the resources to prove him wrong. He looked at the paper in his hand. She died believing it. She died thinking she was in debt to a man she never owed a thing. Sarah was very still. I left that town at 17, he said, because I couldn't fix it. I didn't know enough. I didn't have the tools. He folded the list of names and put it in his jacket pocket. I have the tools now. She looked at him for a long time. Something in her face had gone soft in a way he didn't think she would have allowed if she'd been thinking about it. But she wasn't thinking about it. She was just feeling it, the plain weight of what he'd said and what it meant. I'm sorry about your mother, she said. So am I, he said. Every day. The moment sat between them warm and specific the way moments do when 2 people have just handed each other something real. Then from outside came the sound of horses. More than one. Moving at speed down Main Street at an hour when Main Street was not supposed to have traffic. They both went still. Caleb moved to the edge of the window, looked out at the angle that kept him from being visible. 3 horses. The riders weren't stopping on Main Street. They were heading toward the eastern edge of town. Where does that road go? He said. East Road, Sarah said behind him. It goes to the telegraph relay station, the secondary line. She paused. If someone rode to the relay station tonight, they could intercept the line before it reaches Denver, Caleb said. Or flag the Denver office directly. Tell them the wire from Red Hollow is a false report. Discredit it before it's acted on. She made a sound that was not quite a word. How much does Hargrove have in Denver? Caleb said. I don't know, she said. I've wondered. The land company filings came through Denver. He has a lawyer there. Beyond that, if he has someone at the federal level, Caleb said, the telegram may not be enough. He turned from the window. She was looking at him, and her face had gone to the iron she kept in reserve for worst-case situations. But her hands had pressed flat on the counter again, the way they did when she was using the furniture to stay upright, and he noticed that and filed it. Then what do we do? She said. The telegram buys us time, he said. Whether it gets there clean or gets flagged, the act of sending it means Hargrove has to assume federal attention is coming, and that changes how he can move. He can't be as visible. He thought for a moment. But we can't wait for Denver. We have to build this case from inside Red Hollow from the ground up so that when a marshal does arrive, whenever that is, there's nothing left to bury. Silas, she said, The deed records. The families. And Thomas Wick, he said. The coroner. If Marsh's man reaches him tonight and Wick understands that his signature on a falsified report is already being examined, he may come forward before Victor can get to him. Or Victor will get to him first and make sure he doesn't. That's the race, Caleb said simply. She looked at him. He could see her absorbing that, not collapsing under it, not pretending it wasn't true, just taking it in and standing with it the way she stood with everything. I'm not going to be able to sleep, she said. I know. Are you going back to the boarding house? He looked at the door, at the window, at the single lock she'd thrown when she let him in. He thought about 3 horses riding to the relay station. He thought about Victor Hargrove, who was not stupid, moving faster than expected. No, he said. I'll stay here tonight. Here. She looked at him, and he understood what was in her face. Not suspicion, not discomfort, but a kind of raw gratitude that she immediately tried to keep from showing, because she had learned in 19 days that the appearance of need was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. I'll sleep in the back, he said. You take the stool. Neither of us is sleeping much either way. She nodded, short, controlled. He settled himself in the narrow space of the back room, and she sat at her desk, and the night moved around them, and somewhere east of them 3 horses were carrying Hargrove's reach toward the telegraph relay, and somewhere in Pueblo a rider was either already on the road or not yet. And somewhere in the structures of this town, the weight of 6 years of carefully maintained lies was beginning slowly to shift. Around midnight, Sarah spoke from the other room. Caleb. Yeah, the woman who sent me the note, she said, the anonymous note. He was quiet. What note? In my mail slot, 3 days after it happened. She paused. I didn't tell you about it. It said you are not alone. There are others. Wait. The silence stretched. I thought it was a trick, she said. I thought Hargrove was testing me, seeing if I would act on it. Her voice was carefully neutral. I waited. Nothing came. I decided I'd been right. That it was meant to keep me passive and waiting while he secured everything. But now, Caleb said. But now I think it was real, she said. I think whoever left that note knew about the other families, knew the system, has been watching it the same way I have from the inside and waiting for something to change. A pause. The same person who left the note in your room. He thought about that. Someone who's been inside this long enough to know everything, he said slowly, and who has been waiting for the right catalyst. Yes. Who in this town, he said carefully, would have access to everything Hargrove controls but still have enough conscience left to want it undone? The silence was long. Then Sarah said very quietly, his wife. Caleb opened his eyes in the dark. Eleanor Hargrove, Sarah said. She runs the household accounts. She has access to the mayor's papers. She processes his correspondence when he travels. A pause that felt like a held breath. She came into the post office 2 months ago and asked me very quietly and very casually whether I had ever had reason to file a property complaint with the territorial office and what the process would be. She was asking how to document what her husband had done, Caleb said. I think so. I didn't understand it at the time. I thought she was asking for a friend. A pause. She's not the kind of woman who has friends. She sent both notes, Caleb said. I think yes. He lay in the dark and put this new piece into the map and felt the entire shape of it change. Not just a man with a conscience in Hargrove's hired circle, the mayor's own wife. A woman with access to the papers, the records, the correspondence. A woman who had been building her own case from the inside, waiting for someone from outside the system to appear and give the whole structure somewhere to fall. She's been collecting evidence, he said. She may have everything we need, Sarah said. We need to reach her, Caleb said. Tomorrow, before Victor moves. She comes to the post office on Fridays for her household correspondence, Sarah said. Tomorrow is Friday. The dark room around him felt charged like the air before lightning. Then tomorrow, he said, we see if Eleanor Hargrove is ready to end what her husband built, Sarah didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that had not been there 10 minutes ago, something alert and forward-leaning, something that had stopped looking at the floor and started looking at what was ahead. "She'll be terrified," Sarah said. "So are you," Caleb said. "You sent the wire anyway." A silence. "Get some rest," he said. "You're going to need it." Outside Red Hollow lay dark and apparently still, the way a town lies when it has decided to look like nothing is happening. But in the mayor's house at the north end of Main Street, a lamp was burning in a second-floor window, and it had been burning since the horses rode out for the relay station, and whoever was sitting in that lamplight was sitting very still and had been for a long time. And in the post office on the corner, two people who had chosen each in their own way, at the cost of things that cost, to look at the truth and not look away, kept watch through the night until the dark began slowly to turn toward morning. Eleanor Hargrove came into the post office at 8:43 in the morning, which was 17 minutes earlier than her usual Friday time, and Sarah noticed that immediately because Sarah noticed everything. Eleanor was 53 years old and had the posture of a woman who had spent 3 decades making sure no one could read her. She was dressed well the way the mayor's wife was always dressed well, and her face was composed in the particular way of a woman who had long ago made composure into armor. She carried a small leather satchel over one arm. She came to the counter and set 2 outgoing letters on the wood between herself and Sarah, and she did not look at Caleb, who was standing to the left of the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrove," Sarah said. "Good morning." Eleanor's eyes moved across Sarah's face, and then very briefly to Caleb. Just a flicker, calibrating. "I'm also expecting a letter from my sister in Richmond." Sarah turned to the slot. The letter was there. She brought it back and set it on the counter. Eleanor's hand came down on top of it. She didn't pick it up immediately. Her fingers rested on the envelope, and in that pause, that specific deliberate pause, she said at normal conversational volume, but with something underneath it, like a current under still water. "I also wanted to ask about a property filing, for a friend." Sarah's hands went very still on the counter. "Of course," Sarah said. "What kind of filing?" "The kind," Eleanor said, "that involves documented evidence of false claims made against a legal title." She looked at Sarah directly now, full and level. "My friend has gathered a considerable amount of documentation, letters, records, copies of the original territorial filings, correspondence between certain officials." She paused. "My friend has been gathering this for approximately 2 years and has been waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it." The post office was absolutely quiet. Caleb had not moved from where he stood. He was watching Eleanor Hargrove with the focused stillness of a man who understood that what was happening in this room was fragile and needed no interference from him. "Your friend," Sarah said carefully, "sounds like someone who's been very patient." "My friend," Eleanor said, "is someone who understood that patience without a catalyst produces nothing." Her eyes moved to Caleb again, stayed there for a moment, then came back to Sarah. "I heard about the telegram. Mrs. Hargrove, he doesn't know I know," Eleanor said, and for the first time the composed surface cracked just at the edges, just enough to see the thing underneath which was not weakness but something more like controlled fury that had been kept in a jar for a very long time. "Dalton thinks I don't understand what he does. He has thought that for 31 years. It has been enormously useful to me." She opened her satchel. She placed a wrapped package on the counter between herself and Sarah. It was tied with cord thick with papers, and it landed with the particular weight of something significant. "This is a copy," Eleanor said. "The originals are in a location my husband cannot access. If anything happens to me—" She paused, composed herself, continued. "If anything happens to me, a second copy goes to the territorial governor's office in Denver by registered post. I made those arrangements 14 months ago." Sarah's hand moved toward the package. She didn't touch it. She looked at Eleanor. "Why now?" she said. "Because," Eleanor said, "of what he did to you." The words came out plain and level, and they hit the room like a stone hitting water. I have watched my husband bend this town to his will for 20 years, and I have made my accommodations. I told myself there were reasons. Told myself it was complicated. Told myself the things people tell themselves. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was beyond apology but carried the shape of it. And then my son did what he did, and my husband buried it, and I watched you stand at this counter every day for 19 days, and I understood that I had run out of accommodations. Sarah was very still. Caleb stepped forward from the wall. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. His voice was quiet. "What's in the package?" Eleanor looked at him. Records of 6 property fraud cases spanning 11 years. Copies of the original clean territorial filings alongside Dalton's fabricated irregularity claims. Correspondence between my husband and Dr. Pell going back 4 years. Not just your case, Miss Whitaker, but 2 others. She paused. And a letter signed by Thomas Wick, the circuit coroner, dated 6 months ago, in which he expressed to my husband his concern about being asked to co-sign medical documents he had not personally reviewed. Wick already objected, Caleb said. In writing, Eleanor said, privately, to my husband, who wrote back assuring him that everything was within appropriate legal bounds. She held Caleb's gaze. My husband saves all his correspondence. He believes documentation is power. He's correct. He simply failed to account for the possibility that his documentation would end up in my hands. Caleb looked at the package on the counter. He looked at Eleanor Hargrove. He said, "You've had this for 14 months, and you waited." Yes. Why? Because evidence without a mechanism for delivery is just paper, she said. I'm a woman in Red Hollow, Mr. Morgan. I could not walk into the territorial governor's office and hand them a package and expect to be taken seriously. I needed someone who could carry this in a way that would be heard. She looked at him steadily. Someone outside the system. Someone with no stake in the local power arrangement. Someone who looked at what was in front of them and didn't look away. The room was completely still. Then, from outside came the sound of boots on the boardwalk, and a lot of them, and Caleb moved to the window in 2 steps and looked out, and what he saw made him turn back around with a changed face. "Deputy Larson," he said, "and 4 men, coming this way." Eleanor's composure held, but her hand moved to the counter and gripped it. Sarah's hand went to the package. Her eyes went to Caleb. "Back room," Caleb said to Eleanor. "Now, both of you. I am not going to hide in a—" "You're not hiding," he said. "You're maintaining a position from which you can't be officially seen to have been here. If Larson puts you in the room with that package, Hargrove can claim it was obtained under duress. You need to not have been here." He held her gaze. "Can you go out the back?" Eleanor's jaw was tight. But she was underneath everything. She was a practical woman. She picked up her legitimate letters and her letter from her sister in Richmond, and she left the package on the counter, and she walked through to the back room without another word. Caleb took the package off the counter and put it under the floorboard behind the mail shelf Sarah had shown him the loose board the night before, where she kept her own important papers, and he straightened up and put his hat on just as the door of the post office opened, and Frank Larson walked in. And behind him came 2 of the men Caleb recognized from Denny Marsh's crew, and 2 he didn't. Larson looked at Caleb. He looked at Sarah. He looked around the room with the specific attention of a man who had expected to find something and was not yet sure whether it was here. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I have a legal notice from the mayor's office regarding this property." Sarah stepped up to the counter. Her face was perfectly professional. Whatever she was feeling, and Caleb knew she was feeling considerable things. It was nowhere on her surface. "I'll need to see the paperwork, Deputy." Larson put a document on the counter. Sarah picked it up and read it. Caleb watched her read it. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did something when she reached the bottom of the document, a specific sharpening the face of someone who has just seen through a trick. She put the document back on the counter. "This is a notice of property review," she said, citing an irregularity in the original deed filing. "That's correct. The deed to this property is clean," she said. "I have reviewed it with an independent party, and it is free of any valid irregularity." Larson's jaw tightened. "The mayor's office has the authority to—" The mayor's office has the authority to file a claim with the territorial court, Sarah said. This is a notice, not a claim, not a proceeding. A notice is not actionable. She held the document out to him. You can tell Mayor Hargrove that if he wishes to file an actual legal claim, the territorial court in Pueblo would be the appropriate venue. Dead silence. Caleb stood to the side and kept his face neutral, and thought that Sarah Whitaker had spent 3 years in this post office understanding how the legal machinery of this territory worked, and Hargrove had made the mistake of assuming she was too frightened to use that understanding. Larson didn't take the document back. He looked at Caleb. You're still in town. Man's got a right to stay where he pleases, Caleb said. Victor wants a word with you. Victor knows where to find me. He'd prefer somewhere private. I'll bet he would, Caleb said pleasantly. Larson's jaw was doing something complicated. He had come here to do a specific thing, and it had not worked. And now he was in the room with a woman who had not flinched, and a man who was looking at him with the polite patience of someone who has already considered all the ways this conversation could go, and is comfortable with every one of them. The two men behind Larson shifted slightly. Caleb tracked the shift without moving his eyes. This isn't finished, Larson said. I didn't think it was, Caleb said. Larson picked up his document. He gave the room one more assessment. He left. The door closed. Sarah put both her hands flat on the counter and breathed. Your hands, Caleb said. She looked down. Her knuckles were white. She relaxed them slowly. You were right about the notice, he said. I know property law, she said. I've had to. In a town where the law is whatever Hargrove says it is, you learn to know it better than he does. She looked up. He didn't expect me to know. He's been underestimating you, Caleb said. For a long time. She absorbed that. Then she said, We need to move today, before he tries something else. Caleb went to the back room. Eleanor Hargrove was standing near the back door, and she had the particular look of a woman who had been listening to everything and was recalibrating. You stood him down, Eleanor said to Sarah, who had followed. He gave me a notice, Sarah said. A notice is just paper. Dalton will be furious, Eleanor said. And then something unexpected happened. Something moved across Eleanor Hargrove's face that looked briefly like satisfaction. Raw and complicated and immediately controlled, but real. He cannot stand being told no by someone he's decided doesn't have that right. Then he's going to have a difficult day, Caleb said. He retrieved the package from under the floorboard and held it. Mrs. Hargrove, I need you to tell me who in the 6 families on this list is most likely to come forward if they knew their deed was clean. Eleanor thought for a moment. The Brennans. Patrick Brennan has been paying my husband for 4 years, and it has cost him half his livable income. He's a proud man. The knowledge that he's been robbed rather than legitimately obligated would, she paused, would be significant. And the others, the Wests, and possibly old Gideon Park if someone approached him correctly. He's 80 years old, and I believe he has stopped being afraid of things. Caleb handed the package to Sarah. Keep this here, under the floor, not in your hands. He turned to Eleanor. I need you to go home. Behave normally. If your husband asks where you were this morning, you were doing errands. Can you do that? I have been doing that for 31 years, Eleanor said with a dryness in her voice that under other circumstances might have been humor. One more day, he said. When the time comes to step forward, you'll know. You'll feel the moment. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her satchel, settled her composure back into place like a woman putting on a coat she'd worn 1,000 times, and walked out the back door. Caleb was already moving. Patrick Brennan ran the feed store on the south end of town, and he was a large man, gaunt, slightly soft, with his 50s, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 20 years looking into the sun, and the permanent wariness of someone who'd spent 4 years paying a powerful man money he didn't owe. He looked up when Caleb walked in and immediately did the calculation that men did when an unfamiliar person entered their territory. Help you, Brennan said. Rope and a length of good canvas, Caleb said. He moved to the counter. He paid for the items. He did not immediately leave. Patrick Brennan. Brennan looked at him carefully. Do I know you? No, but I know a man named Silas Hines and a woman named Sarah Whitaker, and they've told me you're a man who was told 4 years ago that your property deed had an irregularity. The blood didn't drain from Brennan's face. It went somewhere more complicated to anger fast and immediate, and then immediately behind it, fear. And those two things fought each other in open view for a moment before Brennan got control of them. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. The mayor's office told you your deed filing from the territorial surveyor had an unresolved error, Caleb said, level and quiet, the same voice he used for everything. They told you that if you paid a monthly arrangement, they would hold the claim in abeyance. They told you if you didn't pay, the territorial court would process the claim and you could lose the property. Brennan said nothing. Your deed is clean, Caleb said. Brennan stared at him. I have reviewed the original territorial filing, Caleb said. It is a legitimate, complete, legally sound document. There is no irregularity. The claim was fabricated. You have been paying money you never legally owed to a man who threatened you with a lie. The silence in the feed store was total. Brennan's hands came down on the counter. He was gripping it the same way Sarah gripped things. Caleb noticed the same reflexive reaching for something solid when the ground moved under you. If you're lying to me? His voice had gone rough. I'm not lying to you, Caleb said. I have documentation. I have the original filing and I have evidence of how the false claims were constructed. I have a witness who was present at the falsification. And I have a telegraph line to the federal marshal's office in Denver that went out last night. Brennan's jaw worked. Hargrove is going to have a great deal to answer for, Caleb said. Very soon. What I need from you is simple. I need you to go today to Silas Hines at the apothecary. I need you to tell him Patrick Brennan is ready to talk. He'll understand. He held Brennan's gaze. That's all. Just those words. A long silence. Brennan said, 4 years. Just that. Just the 2 words with the weight of 4 years of money and fear and a dignity quietly paid away behind them. I know, Caleb said. My wife cried when we made the first payment, Brennan said. She thought we'd done something wrong. She thought it was our fault somehow. I let her think that because I didn't... He stopped. His jaw was very tight. I didn't know how to tell her someone had stolen from us and called it law. Caleb waited. Silas Hines, Brennan said finally. Patrick Brennan is ready to talk. That's all I need. He left the feed store and moved to the west end of town and found Martha West taking in washing behind her house and told her what he had told Brennan in slightly different words, suited to what he could read of her, and she stood with it for a full minute without speaking, and then said, My husband isn't going to believe a stranger. Your husband doesn't have to believe me, Caleb said. Ask him to go look at the original territorial deed himself. Ask him to take it to Silas Hines and ask Silas to show him what he needs to see. She looked at him. Why would Silas... Ask him, Caleb said. Today. He left her and found Gideon Park sitting on his porch because Eleanor Hargrove had been right. Gideon Park was 80 years old and had stopped being afraid of things. And when Caleb sat beside him and told him what was happening in plain language without padding, Gideon listened to the whole of it without interrupting. And when Caleb finished, the old man said, I've been knowing something was rotten in this town for 6 years. I just been too old and too tired to be the one to say it first. You don't have to say it first, Caleb said. Just second. Gideon Park made a sound that might have been a laugh. All right then, son, he said. Second I can do. It was 2 in the afternoon when Victor Hargrove found him. Caleb had come back to Main Street and was outside the apothecary where Silas Hines had already received Patrick Brennan, and was in the process of what Caleb suspected was the most honest conversation either man had had in years when Victor came around the corner with Denny Marsh and 4 men, and this time the guns were forward. Not drawn, but forward. Victor stopped 6 feet away from Caleb and looked at him with the face of a man who has spent the morning watching his certainties develop cracks and has resolved to stop the cracking by force. You've been busy, Victor said. Productive morning, Caleb agreed. You went to Brennan. You went to the Wests. Victor's voice was steady, but there was something happening underneath it, something pressurized. You've been in this town for 3 days, and you think you understand it. I understand enough, Caleb said. Victor stepped closer. This time there was no pretense of social distance. You want to talk about ropes, he said quietly, and the ugliness under the charm was completely visible now, completely unmaskable. You want to go around my town telling stories about rope marks and medical reports. I will bury you under the paperwork of this territory for so long that you will forget what you came here for. You falsified a medical record, Caleb said. Loud enough for the people on the street to hear. He had chosen this corner for exactly that reason, the foot traffic, the open air, the witnesses who could pretend not to listen and would remember every word. You and Dr. Pell and the circuit coroner Thomas Wick co-signed a document that recorded a violent assault as an accidental fall. That document is a federal crime. Thomas Wick, Victor said, will say whatever my father. Thomas Wick signed a letter 6 months ago stating his concern about being asked to co-sign documents he hadn't personally reviewed, Caleb said. That letter is in the possession of people who are not in your father's county. It went out this morning. Victor's face did something it had probably never done in public before. It went uncertain. Just for a second. Just one fractured second of genuine uncertainty, and then it hardened into something that was trying to look like contempt and landing closer to desperation. Marsh, Victor said. Marsh didn't move. Marsh, Victor said again differently. Caleb looked at Denny Marsh. Marsh was looking at the middle distance, which was the careful look of a man who has made a decision and is holding to it. Victor, Marsh said quietly, I think you need to hear the man out. The street went absolutely silent. Victor turned to look at Marsh with an expression that moved through disbelief and into something colder. You work for me. I did, Marsh said. Circumstances changed. What happened next happened fast. Victor's hand moved toward his gun, and Caleb was already moving not for his own weapon, because this was a public street, and he was trying to build a case. Not end a life, he moved inside Victor's reach before the draw was complete, and his hand closed on Victor's wrist, and he applied the specific pressure that a man learned in the army for exactly this situation, the pressure that made the hand open and the gun not fire. And Victor made a sound that was pain and fury, and the particular noise of a man who has never been physically stopped by another person, and cannot process the fact that it is happening. The gun hit the dirt. Caleb held Victor's wrist with one hand and looked at the 4 men behind him. They had not moved. They were looking at Marsh. Marsh said, "Nobody move." Nobody moved. Victor was breathing hard through his nose, bent slightly at the angle Caleb's grip required, and his face was red, and his eyes were doing something that was very close to the thing his face did when he called Sarah's wounds dramatics. That specific expression of a man who could not understand why the world was not doing what he told it. But now it was in a body that was being held by another body, and the experience of physical consequence was visibly foreign to him. "Let go of me," Victor said, very quiet, almost a whisper. "Not yet," Caleb said, just as quiet. "First you're going to listen to me, in front of these people who are pretending not to watch." He glanced at the street where 4 or 5 townspeople had gone very still in the way of people who are listening extremely hard while maintaining deniability. What you did to Sarah Whitaker has a name, and that name is in the federal statutes. What your father did to cover it has a name, and it's in the federal statutes too. What he did to 6 families in this town, with their property deeds, has a name. You have run out of the kind of space where those names don't reach you. Victor's breathing was still hard. His wrist was still held. You thought she was nothing, Caleb said. You thought she was alone. You thought this town would bury what you did because this town has buried everything you've done, and you were right about all of that up until 3 days ago. He held Victor's eyes. A town can stay quiet for a long time, but it cannot stay quiet forever. and when it breaks open, everything comes out at once." He released Victor's wrist. Victor straightened. He was shaking very slightly. Whether it was anger or something else, Caleb couldn't say. He looked at Marsh. He looked at the 4 men who had not moved. He looked at the people on the street who were looking at the ground or the sky or anywhere that was not at him. He picked up his gun from the dirt. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he walked away. Caleb stood in the street and watched him go, and what he was thinking about was not Victor, but the door. Victor had just walked toward the mayor's office at the end of Main Street, the thick adobe walls that meant that father and son were now in the same room, and that room was currently the most dangerous place in Red Hollow. He turned to Marsh. "How fast can your man get back from Pueblo?" "If Wick came willingly," Marsh said, 3 hours. Caleb looked at the angle of the sun. It was just past 2. "We need a plan for tonight," he said, "for whatever comes out of that building." Marsh nodded. He looked down the street at the mayor's office. He looked back at Caleb. "You know they won't go quietly." "I know," Caleb said. "Victor has 8 men who'd follow him into trouble for the right amount of money." "I know that too." "And you," Marsh said carefully, "are 1 man." Caleb looked at him. Then he looked at the feed store where Patrick Brennan was probably still sitting with what he'd learned. He looked at the apothecary, where Silas Hines had spent the last 2 hours becoming a different kind of man than he'd been for 19 days. He looked at the boarding house where Mrs. Haskell had handed him a note and said she was tired of telling herself stories. 1 man, Caleb said, to start with. He walked back to the post office. Sarah looked at his face when he came in and read it the way she had been reading him for 3 days, with the specific attention of a woman who understood that his face told her the truth, whether he chose to or not. "Victor," she said. "He's with his father now." "And tonight?" Caleb looked at her. He thought about all the pieces in their places. The package under the floorboard, the telegram in Denver, the witness in the apothecary, the families who had been told the truth today for the first time in years, the mayor's wife who had been building a case in silence for 14 months, the circuit coroner riding toward Red Hollow from Pueblo with Marsh's man beside him. He thought about the structure of it, the thing he had been building for 3 days from whatever materials the town had in it, the way you built a position from whatever terrain you had. It was not a perfect position, there were gaps in it, but it was real, and it was standing, and on the other side was a man and his son who had just discovered that the thing they thought was solid under their feet had been quietly replaced with something else. "Tonight," he said, "we hold what we built." He looked at her steadily. "Can you get a message to Eleanor Hargrove?" Sarah was already reaching for the paper. The message Sarah sent to Eleanor Hargrove was 7 words written on a plain slip of post office paper. "The time you waited for is tonight." She folded it inside a routine piece of correspondence addressed to the Hargrove household and handed it to the boy who ran errands for the post office on Friday afternoons. And the boy took it without knowing what he was carrying, the way most people in Red Hollow had carried things, without knowing what they were for a very long time. Then Sarah locked the front door of the post office and looked at Caleb and said, "Tell me what tonight looks like." He told her. He had been thinking about it since he walked away from Victor on Main Street, running the terrain the way he ran every terrain, looking for the high ground, the choke points, the places where a smaller force could hold against a larger one. Red Hollow was a town he had known for 3 days, which was not long. But 3 days of real looking was worth more than years of not looking. And he knew where the alleys ran, where the stable sat in relation to the mayor's office, where the telegraph office's back door opened onto the cross street, where a man could move between buildings without being visible from the main road. He explained it to her in plain, organized sentences, the way he explained things: no decoration, no padding, just the shape of it. She listened the way she did everything with her full attention. And when he was done, she asked 3 precise questions that told him she had understood not just the plan, but the reasoning under it, and he answered them, and they looked at each other. 8 men, she said, against you and Marsh. Marsh has 2 men he trusts. Caleb said. And the town is different now than it was this morning. Different how? Brennan knows, he said. The Wests know. Gideon Park knows. Silas Hines has been a different man since he said yes out loud. That kind of thing moves. He looked at her. And Victor showed himself on a public street today. He reached for a gun on Main Street in front of witnesses because I said true things at a volume people could hear. That's a man who's losing control of his own behavior. His father is not losing control, Sarah said. No, Caleb agreed. His father is not. He thought about Dalton Hargrove, the silver hair, the mild voice, the 30 years of careful construction. His father is the one I'm watching. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What does Hargrove do when he can't use the legal machinery? He's never had to find out, Caleb said. That's the gap. She understood immediately. He's built everything on official process, on paperwork, on the appearance of legality. She looked at the floorboard where Eleanor's package sat. Take that away, and he doesn't have a playbook. No, Caleb said. He has Victor. They sat with that. Outside Red Hollow moved through its late afternoon, and the light was going the long gold way that summer light went in Colorado, slanting and warm, making everything look more peaceful than it was. Caleb went to the window and stood to the side of it and watched Main Street. Larson was visible at the far end, talking to one of the men Caleb recognized from Victor's crew. Not casual talking. Larson kept touching his badge with his right hand, the way nervous men touched the things that told them who they were. Larson, Caleb said. Sarah came to stand behind him, keeping herself from the window's sight line the way he'd shown her. He's not a brave man, she said. He does what the money tells him. Money's about to run out, Caleb said. At that moment, the back door of the post office, the one Sarah kept, bolted from the inside, received 3 slow knocks. They both went still. Caleb moved to it. Who's there? A woman's voice, controlled and low. Eleanor Hargrove. He opened the door. She came in, and she was not the composed armored woman of the morning. She was still controlled. Eleanor Hargrove might never in her life be entirely uncontrolled, but something had been stripped back in the hours since she'd left. And what was underneath was a woman who had crossed a line she'd been standing at the edge of for a very long time and was feeling the full weight of what that meant. He knows I was here this morning, she said immediately. Caleb went still. Not that I gave you anything, she said. He doesn't know about the package. But he knows I came to the post office at an unusual time, and he is... She paused. Dalton does not shout. He has never shouted in 31 years of marriage. He asked me very quietly why I had changed my routine, and when I gave him an answer, he looked at me for a very long time in silence. She held Caleb's gaze. He suspects. He doesn't know what he suspects, but he suspects. Does he know about your copies in Denver? Sarah asked. No, Eleanor said. That I am certain of. He would have been considerably less quiet if he did. Then we still have time, Caleb said. Not much, Eleanor said. Victor came home an hour ago, and they have been behind a closed door since then. I put my ear to the hall, and I heard enough. She looked at Caleb steadily. Victor told him about the street, about Marsh, about what you said in public. A pause. Dalton said, "Then we finish this tonight before the morning." Those were his exact words. The air in the room changed. Sarah pressed her hand flat on the nearest surface. Caleb looked at the window. He looked at Eleanor. He made a fast calculation. "Where are the originals?" he said. "The documents you said are somewhere your husband can't access." "In a lockbox," Eleanor said, "at the Pueblo Territorial Records Office, filed under my maiden name 14 months ago. And the Denver copies. With my sister," Eleanor said, "in Richmond, posted 14 months ago with instructions to forward to the governor's office if she did not receive a letter from me every 30 days. She paused. "She received her letter 3 weeks ago." "You have 12 days, Caleb said. "Yes." He looked at her. Eleanor, I need to ask you something and I need the truth. She met his eyes. Ask. When the marshal comes, and he's coming whether it's tomorrow or next week, you will be called to testify. Against your husband, against your son. He held her gaze. Can you do that? The silence was long. Eleanor Hargrove looked at the wall behind Caleb's shoulder, and he could see her going through something internal and genuine and difficult, the kind of process that couldn't be hurried and shouldn't be. Then she looked back at him. Victor did what he did to a 25-year-old woman, she said, who had done nothing in her life but work hard and build something real in a place that made it difficult. Her voice was entirely level. And my husband buried it. And I let it happen because I told myself there were limits to what I could do alone. She stopped. I am done with those limits. Yes, she said. I can testify. Sarah made a sound that was not quite audible. Caleb simply nodded. Then here's what we do, he said. Bog. Denny Marsh came to the post office's back door at 7 in the evening, and he had 2 men with him whose faces Caleb didn't know, but whose bearing he read as reliable men who'd made a decision and were holding to it, not men still calculating. Wick is 4 miles out, Marsh said. My rider made good time. Wick came without argument. He paused. Apparently Hargrove's letter telling him everything was within legal bounds stopped being reassuring somewhere around the 5th rereading. Does Victor know he's coming? Caleb said. Not yet, but Larson's got a man watching the East Road. Marsh looked at Caleb. Victor's moving his crew into position. I count 7 men spread between the saloon and the stable. He's going to try to take the post office tonight, Sarah said from behind Caleb. She said it flat and plain the way she said things when she had made peace with them. That's what it looks like, Marsh said. He can't destroy what's not here, Caleb said. He looked at Sarah. The package. Sarah went to the floorboard. She retrieved Eleanor's wrapped package. She held it for a moment, just a moment, and Caleb saw her looking at it with the expression of someone who understands that the thing in their hands is both fragile and immensely powerful, and that the combination of those 2 qualities is the most dangerous kind. She handed it to Eleanor, who was standing against the back wall with her hands folded in front of her. You should be the one holding this, Sarah said. It was yours to begin with. Eleanor took it. She held it against her chest. Something moved across her face that was too complicated and too private to name. Mrs. Haskell, Caleb said to Marsh. The boarding house. Can she be trusted to keep 2 women safe for the night? She kept your note safe for 3 days, Marsh said. Then take Mrs. Hargrove and Miss Whitaker to the boarding house, Caleb said. Back way, now before the light's fully gone. Sarah turned to him immediately. I am not leaving. Sarah. This is my post office, she said. This is my deed and my property and my body that started all of this, and I am not going to sit in a boarding house while— I need you safe, he said. You need this town to see that I'm not hiding, she said back, and her voice had iron in it. Real iron, the kind that had been forged over 19 days of standing when everything in her wanted to fall. If I disappear into Mrs. Haskell's back room tonight, it looks like exactly what Victor wants it to look like. It looks like I'm afraid. It looks like I can be moved. She held his gaze. I cannot be the woman who hid while someone else fought for her. I cannot live with that. Not after 19 days of being told to be quiet and invisible and patient. She was not shouting. She was something more effective than shouting. I stand here. The room was very still. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the specific quality of her determination, which he had been reading since the first morning he walked into this post office, and found a woman doing the most precise and exhausting kind of brave. Not the loud kind, not the visible kind, but the daily grinding, costly kind that nobody saw and nobody credited. He had been reading her for 4 days. He knew what he was looking at. Then you stand behind the counter, he said, and you do not move from it unless I tell you. Agreed, she said immediately. He looked at Marsh. Mrs. Hargrove to the boarding house. The package goes with her. He looked at Eleanor. When Wick arrives, Mrs. Haskell will know to bring him to you." Eleanor nodded once. She let Marsh and his men take her out the back door, and she went without argument, which told Caleb that Eleanor Hargrove was a woman who picked her battles with great precision, and she had already picked the one that mattered. The post office was quiet. Just Caleb and Sarah and the last of the evening light coming through the front window. "How long?" Sarah said. "An hour," Caleb said. "Maybe less?" She nodded. She went to her counter and stood behind it. She picked up a stack of letters and began to sort them, and for a moment he just watched her do that. The practiced, methodical movement of her hands, the way she had made her work into a kind of armor, and he thought that she was one of the strongest people he had encountered in 34 years of encountering people, and that the town of Red Hollow had been profoundly stupid to try to make her small. "Caleb," she said without looking up from the letters. "Yeah. If this goes badly tonight, it won't. But if it does," she looked up, "I need you to know that what you did these 4 days, what you saw, what you chose to do about what you saw, I had stopped believing that was possible. A person seeing and not looking away." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that before whatever happens tonight." He looked at her for a moment. "It's not going to go badly," he said. But his voice had changed when he said it, had gone to something quieter and more personal than strategy. "And when it's over, I'd like to have a conversation with you that isn't about evidence or legal filings." Something moved across her face, surprised and warm, and immediately reined in because she was a woman who had learned to rein things in. But it was there. "I'd like that too," she said. Then the first sound came from outside. It was not subtle. Victor Hargrove had apparently decided that subtlety had failed him, and that what remained was force, and he applied it with the directness of a man who had stopped thinking about consequences, because consequences were a concept that had always applied to other people, and he hadn't fully updated that belief, despite the evidence of the afternoon. 7 men came down Main Street at 9 in the evening, and Victor was at the front of them, and he walked with the specific energy of someone who had been told by their father to handle this and was going to handle it in the only language he had left. Caleb was standing outside the post office door when they arrived. He was not armed. Or rather, he was armed the way he was always armed, with the knowledge of where his weapon was and how fast he could reach it, but he was not displaying it, because a man who displays his weapon before it's needed has already miscalculated. Victor stopped 10 feet from him. "Move," he said. "No," Caleb said. Same as before. Flat and final. "I will burn that building down," Victor said. And the thing that was alarming about how he said it was that it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a statement of intention from a man who had already moved past the point where threats served a purpose. "In front of 7 witnesses," Caleb said. "On Main Street." "In a town where I say what happened," Victor said. "Not anymore," Caleb said. And then Patrick Brennan stepped out of the shadow of the feed store across the street. Victor's head turned. Brennan was not a man built for dramatic moments. He was a feed store owner in his 50s who smelled like grain and had a permanent squint. He crossed the street with the walk of a man who was terrified and had decided to be terrified in public rather than safe in private. And he came to stand beside Caleb Morgan without looking at him, looking instead at Victor Hargrove. "Patrick?" Victor's voice had gone careful. "Go home." "I don't think so," Brennan said. His voice shook slightly. He didn't try to hide it. Silas Hines came out of the apothecary. He walked to the other side of Caleb and stood there, and he had his hands in his coat pockets, and his jaw was tight with the particular expression of a man who has been living with a decision he's ashamed of and has just made the one that replaces it. Martha West came out of the alley between the 2 nearest buildings, her husband behind her. Gideon Park, who was 80 years old and had stopped being afraid of things, came down the street from the north end, walking with a cane, moving slowly with the absolute unhurried authority of a man who understood that his presence was the statement and was making it fully. Victor's 7 men had gone very still, not because they were outnumbered. The people assembling on Main Street were not. Fighters were not armed in the way that Victor's hired crew was armed. They were a feed store owner, and an apothecary, and a woman with her husband, and an old man with a cane. They were just people. But they were standing in the open, which was the one thing they had not done for years, and the act of standing was its own kind of force, the kind that guns did not have a good answer to. Denny Marsh appeared at the edge of the street. Victor looked at him with an expression that had finished going through all its other phases and arrived at something bare and unfamiliar, something that was very close to the look of a man confronting a self-concept that is no longer functioning. "Marsh," Victor said, "you're finished in this territory." "Probably," Marsh said. "I can live with that." Victor's hand went toward his gun, and a voice came from the north end of Main Street that stopped everything. "Victor Hargrove." The voice was federal. It had the specific quality of authority that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty of its own standing, the voice of a man who has never once doubted that when he speaks in his official capacity, the words carry legal weight. Everyone on Main Street heard it and understood it in the same instant. Thomas Wick, the circuit coroner, had not come alone from Pueblo. Beside him on a horse that was breathing hard from a long ride was a man in a federal marshal's coat, and behind that man were two deputies, and they had been riding since 2 in the afternoon because a telegram had come into the Denver office the night before. And when the Denver office read that telegram, they had sent a rider to Pueblo to collect Thomas Wick because Wick's name was in the telegram, and the 4 of them had made very good time. The marshal's name was Isaiah Cord, and he was 51 years old, and had been doing this work for 22 years, and he had the look of a man who had seen every variety of small-town corruption that the territory could produce, and was not surprised by any of it. He dismounted without hurry and walked to the center of Main Street. "I'm looking for the postmistress," Cord said. "Sarah Whitaker." The post office door opened. Sarah walked out. She walked out of her post office and onto Main Street in the summer dark of Red Hollow, Colorado. And she stood in the open for the first time in 22 days. The 22 days since what Victor Hargrove had done to her, and the 19 days she had stood at her counter in pain, and the 3 days since Caleb Morgan had walked through her door and seen what no one else had chosen to see, and she held her head level and her back straight, despite everything that cost her. And she looked at Isaiah Cord and said, "I'm Sarah Whitaker." Victor made a movement. Caleb stepped between Victor and Sarah before the movement finished, and he did it without hurry, without drama, without any of the performance that the moment might have invited, and he stood there and looked at Victor, and Victor looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was the final accounting of everything that had happened in the 4 days since a mountain man came off the slope of the Sangre Range to pick up a package and found something worth staying for. Victor did not complete the movement. Cord looked at Victor. "Victor Hargrove," he said, "you'll come with me. You have no basis. I have a sworn statement from Thomas Wick regarding the falsification of an official medical record," Cord said. "I have a telegraph communication documenting that falsification in material detail, and I have," he reached into his coat, "a set of documents forwarded to my office this afternoon from a lockbox at the Pueblo Territorial Records Office filed 14 months ago under the name Eleanor Marsh née Caldwell." He let that name sit there. "Your wife's maiden name, Mr. Hargrove." Victor went absolutely still. "Where is Eleanor?" he said. Very quiet. The quiet of a man who has just discovered the dimensions of what he didn't know. "Cooperating fully with federal inquiry," Cord said, "as is her right." Dalton Hargrove had appeared at the end of Main Street at some point during this, had walked out of his office when the noise reached him, or had been watching from the moment Cord rode in. Caleb wasn't sure, and he stood at the edge of it all in his silver-haired dignity, and Caleb looked at him across the length of the street. Dalton was looking at Cord, then at the assembled townspeople, then at the documents in Cord's hand, and his face, which had been mild for 30 years, was doing something that mild faces did when the architecture under them collapsed. It was going blank, and then it was going old, and then it was going to the face of a man who has just understood for the first time in a very long time that he is not holding the cards. "Dalton Hargrove," Cord said, raising his voice to Carrie. "You'll be accompanying us as well." Larson took one look at the situation and unpinned his badge. He unpinned it right there on Main Street and held it for a moment and then set it down on the boardwalk at his feet. And he walked away down the side street without looking at anyone, and nobody stopped him because he was a frightened man who had just become irrelevant, which was in its own way a sufficient consequence. Victor's 7 men looked at each other. Then they looked at Cord's deputies. Then one by one they stepped back. It was over in the way that things built on lies are over when the lies run out, not with the crash of a dramatic final moment, but with a series of small surrenders, each one quieter than the last, until the silence was total, and the thing that had been Red Hollow's power structure was simply no longer standing. Thomas Wick sat in the back room of the post office for 2 hours that night and gave Cord everything he had. He was a small man with a precise manner who had made a bad decision under pressure 14 months ago and had been trying to live with it ever since, and the relief of not having to carry it anymore was visible in the way his shoulders dropped when he began to speak. Silas Hines gave his statement outside on the boardwalk, while Brennan and the Wests and Gideon Park waited their turns and talked among themselves in the low voices of people who have just discovered that they have been living in the same silence and never knew it about each other. Eleanor Hargrove sat in Mrs. Haskell's parlor and gave Cord 3 hours of detailed, organized, documented testimony, and she gave it with the clarity of a woman who had been organizing it in her mind for 14 months and was now simply reading from a structure she had already built. Mrs. Haskell brought her tea and sat beside her and held her hand at the moments when the testimony required holding, and Eleanor did not cry, but once she stopped speaking for a full minute and looked at the wall and breathed, and Mrs. Haskell did not fill that silence, which was the right thing. Caleb gave his statement last. He sat across from Cord in the post office and told it straight and plain, beginning to end, and when he finished, Cord looked at him for a long moment and said, "You did this in 4 days." "The work was mostly already done," Caleb said, "by people who'd been doing it alone for years. I just provided a point where it could converge." Cord looked at him with the expression of a man who respected precision. "You're on the Army record." "I'm out of the Army. I can see that." Cord closed his notebook. "You'll need to stay in Red Hollow for a few more days, testimony purposes." "That's fine," Caleb said. Cord left. Caleb sat alone in the post office for a moment. Then he heard Sarah's footsteps from the back room where she had been giving her own statement separately, and she came and sat on the stool behind her counter, and they were quiet together, in the way of people who have been through something real and are letting it settle. "It's done," she said. "It started," he said. "The legal part goes on for a while." "But the thing that was holding it all in place," she said, "that's done." "Yes," he said, "that's done." She was quiet for a moment. She had her hands folded on the counter in front of her, not pressing, not gripping, just resting there. He noticed that. She noticed him noticing. "I sat down today," she said. "When I was giving my statement, I sat in the chair across from Marshal Cord, and I said what happened to me, and I sat in the chair for 2 hours. She looked at her hands. "It hurt. But I sat." He looked at her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would improve on what she had just said. "You said you wanted a conversation," she said. "After." "I did." "What kind of conversation?" He looked at her across the counter of her post office in the town she had built 3 years of her life in the building whose deed was clean and had always been clean and would remain hers. He looked at a woman who had stood for 19 days in pain and sent a wire in the dark and put her hand on the telegraph key and said, "Tell me what to write," and walked out of her own door onto Main Street in front of a federal marshal and said her own name. "The kind," he said, "where I ask if there's anything left in Red Hollow worth staying for." The thing that moved across her face this time, she did not rein in. It was warm and complicated and surprised and real, and she let it be there. And it was the first unguarded thing he had seen on her face in 4 days, and it was worth the 4 days. "I might know of something," she said. Outside Red Hollow was quieter than it had been in years. The particular quiet of a place where a weight has been lifted that had been there so long, the people under it had stopped knowing it was weight. Gideon Park was still on the street talking to Patrick Brennan. their voices low and easy. Mrs. Haskell had lit every lamp in the boarding house front room. Denny Marsh was sitting on the steps of the saloon doing nothing, just sitting with the peaceful expression of a man who has put something down that was too heavy. And in the post office, Sarah Whitaker sat at her counter in a chair, not behind it, not standing, not gripping the wood, just sitting. And Caleb Morgan sat across from her, and they talked. Not about evidence, not about legal filings, not about what came next, just talked. The way two people talk when the crisis is over, and what remains is the human part, the part that was there before the crisis, and will be there after the part that is quieter than danger and more durable than fear. The mountain wind came down off the Sangre Range the way it always did in summer. Cool and clean, carrying the smell of high pine and granite, and the particular clarity of air that had been nowhere near a town, and it moved through the open door of the post office like a reminder that the world above the valley was still there, unchanged, unhurried. Caleb looked at the open door, looked at the dark outline of the mountains against the sky. Sarah looked at him, looking at them. "You miss it," she said. "Always," he said. "But I've learned that the mountains aren't going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. "Neither is the post office," she said. And that was enough. That was exactly enough. In Red Hollow, Colorado, in the long summer of 1881, the truth had finally been spoken at full volume by people who had been paying the cost of silence for long enough that the price of speaking felt by comparison like freedom. The law would come and do its slow, necessary work. The Hargrove name would go through the machinery of the territorial court and come out the other side diminished to its true size. The 6 families would get their deeds confirmed clean by an authority that could not be bought because it was no longer local. Silas Hines would spend the rest of his years in Red Hollow being a different kind of man, the kind that looked at things directly and that would cost him sometimes and be worth it always. And Eleanor Hargrove would leave Red Hollow in the fall on a stage heading east with a lockbox and a letter of federal cooperation and the upright posture of a woman who had spent 31 years building something in secret that turned out, when finally opened, to be the key to everything. But on this night, in this moment, what mattered was simpler than any of that. A woman who had stood alone for 19 days was sitting down, and the man who had come off the mountain and seen her and refused to look away was sitting across from her. And they were talking, and the truth that had been buried in Red Hollow was buried no longer, and every person in that town who had stayed silent was now living in a world where the silence had ended, and the walls it had built were coming down, and the air in the valley felt different because of it. Cleaner, lighter. The way air feels after a long storm finally breaks and the sky opens up, and you remember that the sky was always supposed to be that color. Some things once spoken cannot be unspoken. Some debts once named cannot be uncollected. And some women once believed change every town they stand in forever.